For the next few weeks, we wanted to do a Bible study where we're talking through the book of Jude. It's just a very little book at the very end of your New Testament. There's Revelation at the very end, and then this little one-page or maybe two-page book of Jude. It's just one chapter. Doesn't take very long at all to read through it, but it's kind of an important book. It talks about how important it is to stay straight with what you know, and that there are false ideas and there's false teachers out there all the time, and that we need to be careful not to allow ourselves to get sidetracked by all these different versions of reality. We talked a little bit in a sermon series earlier this year, a book called Live No Lies by John Mark Comer. Still recommend that. And it's a great book that talks about how a lot of times our reality is being challenged by the devil and by our flesh, our animal appetite, and then also by the world. And if you don't watch out, you can get so caught up in this other form of reality that you lose sight of what the truth is. And when we're talking about Christian faith and Christian living, that's crazy, super serious. So Jude comes along and he writes this letter to kind of challenge his people, the ones he has influence on, to stay true. Now, it starts off real easy. It starts off here, Jude, servant of Jesus Christ and the brother of James. And this is really the only indication we have of who this Jude is. Traditionally, it's thought that if he's talking about James here, that this James is probably the brother of Jesus, the one who becomes the head of the Jerusalem church. He's mentioned a lot of times in the Bible, in Galatians 2 and in Acts 15 and different places, that this brother of Jesus became the leader of the church. And probably when he's mentioning James here, that's the brother he's talking about. And if he's that James's brother, then he's also the half-brother of Jesus. And it mentions that. It mentions that Jesus has a half-brother named Judah or Jude in Mark 6:3 mentions him with James, and at least one other place it mentions him there. And so here's this Jude, and he's a half-brother of Jesus, and you would think that would give you quite a bit of street cred there in the early church, but Jude never lays any claim to that. He just says, I'm a servant of Jesus. I just follow him, and we're not equals. And he doesn't pretend to be an equal there. And he's writing it to those who have been called, to those who are loved in God the Father, who are kept for Jesus Christ. Mercy, peace, love be yours in abundance. And all this is pretty standard for how a lot of letters in the New Testament were written. A lot of Paul's letters kind of start off the same way. His emphasis here is what God does. At the beginning, God has called you, and God has loved you, and God has kept you safe. God's done all the work. And I think that's kind of important as we get into the rest of this part, because you could read it like Jude is saying, you got to take control of your own salvation. And that's not what he's saying. God's done his part. That's more Jude's point. God has done his part, and God continues to do his part. But that doesn't mean there's nothing for you to do, and there's nothing for you to think about, and there's nothing for you to keep in mind. And that's where the next couple verses go. He says in Jude chapter 1:3, dear friends, or King James I think says beloved, and that might be a better translation. Dear friends, though I was very eager to write you about the salvation we share, I felt compelled to write and urge you to contend for the faith that was once for all entrusted to all of God's holy people. So I planned, he says, to write you a happy note about how we're all Christians, isn't that great? But then I felt compelled, he says, like God was just putting it on my heart. I needed to say something about this other thing, and I needed to get on you about this. I need you to contend for the faith entrusted to all God's people. It's the Greek word that we would get the word agony from. Is actually, the word was normally used like in a wrestling connotation. You agonize to win the match. And he said, I felt compelled to write and urge you to agonize about this, to contend for it, to really give effort to it, for this faith. His concern is that you were given the truth, and now you're starting to wander away from it. And then he explains even further on that. He says certain individuals, he says you've got some bad seed there amongst you. Certain individuals whose condemnation was written about long ago. So these are the guys who are not tied to Jesus. They're not tied to his way of life at all. He says they've secretly slipped in. It paints it like it's a battle, like the spies have crept in when you weren't paying attention. It's really dark kind of language here. And says they're ungodly people. They pervert the grace of our God into a license for immorality. So they confuse, right? this word grace, they confuse this with this license to do anything. The idea being, if God's going to forgive us anyway, why don't we just do whatever we want, right? And that's not an idea that was only had when Jude's writing it. We still sometimes argue about things like that. I mean, you still hear people in Christian churches argue about things, kind of things. Does it really matter? Can I just do this and be forgiven? You know, I want to do this thing. I know I shouldn't do it. And I've had people tell me through the years, when I suggest maybe they're on a wrong path, well, God will have to forgive me for that, because I'm going to do it anyway. And that's the same kind of logic here. He says certain individuals, they've crept in, they snuck in, and you should have seen it coming, but you didn't. And now they're teaching you that it's okay not to stay true to God, right? And really, it's just those 4 verses that I kind of want to focus on. They've slipped in, and you've let them slip in, and now you're not living the right way. Now you're starting to wonder if maybe the things you were holding true to, that they even mattered. And so a couple of lessons here for the first thing. First, we need to know what we believe. You know, sometimes as Christians, we take it for granted that there'll always be a preacher on Sunday morning, or a teacher in the small group, or even, you know, your favorite podcast or Christian book author, you know, and I can always go to them and kind of get recentered. But you need to have a basic idea of what it is you believe. Otherwise, Jude's saying you're going to fall for anything. Right? If you don't have some concrete idea about what it is you believe and why you believe it. So the first thing is, man, we need to be in our Bibles. We need to be studying. We need to be asking questions. And it's just like weightlifting or any sort of an exercise. You know, when you first start, you're going to be weak, and you're going to feel weak, especially compared to the other guys in the gym. Don't let that intimidate you. Just every day I want to get a little stronger. Every day I want to get a little closer. And you need to know what you believe. But the second thing here, we need to be careful about people whose lives don't match what they say. It's a lot to write down. Whose lives don't match what they say. Should have had a smaller point. You know, the hard part with some of the teachers that we get, you know, especially if you don't know them personally, like on a podcast or a TV show or an author or something like that, or just some preacher that you only get to hear every so often when you're on YouTube or those kind of things. What you got to be careful about any of those kind of things is if their life's not matching the stuff they're saying, that's always a red flag. And as a Christian, we should always be a little suspicious of that. Doesn't mean they don't have anything good to say. I mean, none of us are perfect, and you can point to any speaker and find flaws. And I mean, it's not. I don't mean that. I mean, where they're actively going a different direction with their life, and there's no apologies for it. And in fact, they get real defensive and they stonewall you. Any sort of a leader that kind of goes that direction, you should be very careful about that thing, and you should hold some suspicion, and be careful about giving your heart to somebody who it seems like their life's not matching what they say. The Bible talks about this. Titus says there's some kinds of teachers who claim to know God, but by their actions they deny him. Jesus talked about that with the Pharisees in Matthew 23. He says, you need to do what they tell you. Their advice is usually good advice, but don't do what they do. They don't practice what they preach. Now, actually, this verse here is kind of instructive. Even out of the worst sort of hypocrite, you can still find interesting things. I mean, the worst sort of hypocrite might tell you something about God that helps you out. You know, he tells them with these Pharisees, you know, do what they tell you. You know, they know a lot, but don't imitate their lives, and don't get too close to them, or you'll head down the wrong direction. I was reading Calvin and Hobbes. I'll kind of leave you with this. Reading a Calvin and Hobbes a week or two ago, and it says, Calvin's asking Hobbes, do you think our morality is defined by our actions? What's in our hearts? Calvin asks Hobbes, and Hobbes comes back. He says, I think our actions show what's in our heart. And then you get Calvin thinking on that thing. Because what Calvin would like to say is, sure, I do bad stuff, but my heart's right. Sure, I do bad stuff, but my heart, is really in the right place. And Hobbes, the stuffed tiger, just kind of wrecks that whole plan for him. He resents it. I do too. I wish I could be judged by what I would like to to be. But that's not how life works, right? We're judged by who we are, by what we do. Our actions show what we really believe. And when we talk about people who you trust to help you out and to teach, you want to be careful about the people you come in. So, big lessons. Make sure you work hard to know what you believe. Study real hard and ask questions and try to get deeper. And second, be careful who all you let influence you. And I guess I could talk about this, especially if it's somebody who doesn't even pretend to be Christian. But for sure, even for a Christian who says that that's what they believe, but their lives don't match it, just be real careful about that sort of thing.